Okay, Buzzkillers, it's me, it's Professor Buzzkill, and fortunately for you, we have on the line via the internets Dr. Claude Clegg, who's the Lyle V. Jones Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of North Carolina, and he's come here to talk to us about a very, very important new book, The Black President, Hope and Fury in the Age of Obama. Thanks for coming on the show, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
The press is calling this the first sweeping, legacy-defining history of the entire Obama presidency. It's been very well received. It's extremely substantial. I wonder if you could tell our listeners what it's like being an historian and writing a book about something that's so recent.
That's a great question. And it's one of the things I take up very early on in the preface of the book.
Yeah.
We historians tend to be folks who want to see the thing in the rearview mirror and not through the front glass, not through the windshield. We like to see the dirt or the dust of history and time settle on something, and then we make our judgments and our interpretations, as opposed to, let's say, political scientists or anthropologists or ethnographers who are just fine watching this thing unfold that they're studying and they're researching and they're going to write about. So we tend to, as historians, to use the hindsight of the present to read the past. Mm-hmm. So that was both a challenge of the book and I think one of the rewards of the book. That is, I knew that we all were looking at something historic when it came to the presidential primaries of 2008 between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton and others. So as those two went back and forth, I knew we were either going to have the first woman as the candidate of a major political party in the United States or the first African American. So either one of them would have been historic, and both of them had a good chance to be president, I believe.
Yeah.
So back then, as early as 2008, as I was watching this unfold on the television and the internet and so forth, I knew that we were watching something historic. But the question is, what does that mean? That is, you're watching something historic. Typically, something becomes historic once we've had some distance from it so that we can make a judgment that there is some rupture, there is some break in this particular event, and thus something we need to learn and memorialize about it. So that was what I had to grapple with as a historian, how to put together a historical archive of materials about the Obama presidency and collect what to collect, how to collect these things in a digital age as you're watching his presidency unfold, and then how to think about it in historical terms when you didn't have historical hindsight. So you wouldn't have historical hindsight on his presidency until it ended on January 20th, 2017. That was the challenge. Of course, the further challenge is, did you get it right? In hindsight, 50 years from now or 100 years from now, and people go back and read the book, well, they say, he got these things right. And these other things were the big historical takeaways that he may have missed. You take those chances. But I think that my effort to be very comprehensive with the book and more or less collect everything and to discuss everything about his presidency, I think covered most of the blind spots that, some latter day historian might say the book didn't cover. I think I covered the things that ideally in 20 or 40 or 100 years from now, people will say should have been covered.
Oh, yes, I think you did too. And of course, it's the first major work, so it'll be the sort of paradigm-setting book for Obama studies. But before we get into the meat of the book, one of the things our listeners may not know is that, especially when you're studying political figures, and especially people at the highest level, presidents, there are archives that are sealed for a certain number of years. And I can't remember in American history whether it's 50 years or 75 years or whatever it is. But that's one of the reasons why history is so dynamic, because we're finding new stuff literally all the time. So I kind of wonder what it's like putting a book together like this. But I'm just hoping, crossing your fingers that we'll both be around in 50 years, that we can see what happens when the archives open.
Yeah. So that's one of the challenges of being among the first that, and as opposed to waiting 5, 10, 25 years, and we'll get some good stuff, I hope, from those archives, those emails. He's going to be the first president to have a wholly digital archive, to the consternation of some historians and others. None of this stuff is going to come out. It's all going to come out digitally. So he'll be the first president to do that. And those things, as you're saying, Joe, are not available now, but they eventually will be. And I think that those will give us, again, ideally, depending on what gets redacted and doesn't get declassified, they'll give us some sense in regard to the inner workings of the administration and the different offices and officers of the administration and so forth, which I think is a somewhat different project than what I was doing.
Yes, yeah.
My project had much more to do with the context of his presidency. I'm interested, of course, in his biography and his policies and his politics and the sort of political negotiations that are going on, but also the larger context in which he's operating in regard to the electorate and how it's responding to him, in regard to the political tenor of the times, in regard to his opponents, of course, and the media cycle and so forth, and the sort of big moments in his presidency as well. So I think the archive, ideally, when it is available, will shed some light again on the inner workings of the institution of the president, which is, again, a different kind of project and will be something for future historians to use. But I think having written about his presidency so early, using a vast array of things, like there are government documents that have been declassified, I've talked to people, there are interviews, there's the media cycle, there's memoir and video and all those sort of things. There's almost too much stuff.
Yeah, well, that is true.
Our digital age. Yeah, you can see a ton of stuff sitting at your computer in regard to the things that are in our current media cycle and are with the building blocks, the sources of our current times. So I hope to be around when the Obama papers are available and redacted and whatever court filings, have to take place to get things declassified. But again, my project was not to do a sort of close inside the negotiations, inside the sort of politicking of the day-to-day life of President Obama, but instead to give the sort of the grand patterns of his presidency and the sort of grand movements of his presidency and how it is intertwined with the culture, political culture in which it finds itself.
So I'm glad you said that thing about context, because I think one of the great strengths of the books is that the first major theme that you address is about that context and about how Black America reacted to Obama. And I just have to, because it's a great sentence and it's a great way to set up not only the book, but this interview, I want to read out for the Buzzkillers what you have in your introduction, and that this theme was, quote, that the prolific diversity of Black America resulted in complex, layered, and fractured views and experiences of the Obama presidency and its meaning. That, to me, is such an important phrase, because so many people in the culture, it seems to me, think of Black America as one thing, Black voters as one group, of one type of group that act a certain way, and on and on and on and on and on. And one of the strengths of this show, I like to flatter myself, is that we show the complexity of what really happened.
I think that's a great point. And again, it's one of the core things, one of the core through lines of the book. That is, although Obama, we got 96% of the African-American vote, the Black vote in 2008, and then about 93% in 2012. If you peel that back, and by the way, most any Democratic candidate for the presidency is going to get, in this day and age, a huge percentage of the Black vote. The question is whether the absolute numbers, whether people actually come out, and the numbers, not the percentages necessarily. So if you peel back that, you see such a diverse range of opinion, of interpretations, of aspirations in regard to the Obama presidency coming from African Americans. You see it among academics like myself. Some of his most vociferous and relentless critics are among academics who some think he's not doing enough in terms of poverty, alleviating poverty, in terms of foreign policy, in terms of climate change and a host of other things, transparency, and they think he's too neoliberal or too conservative and so forth. You see it in regard to religious figures. Talked to several of them, and there are those who had real issues with his support for abortion rights. There are those who had real issues when the administration in 2012 publicly embraced same-sex marriage. And there are those who said they were going to tell their congregations not to ever vote for this man. This is a huge betrayal and so forth. There are those in the Congressional Black Caucus, which is primarily in the House of Representatives, who wanted Obama to really have targeted policies towards African Americans and those who were most vulnerable during this Great Recession that he inherited when he came into office in 2009. And they thought that since African Americans had the highest rates of wealth loss during the Great Recession, loss of homes, their unemployment rate was highest among any groups in the country. Obama, as the president, who received such a high percentage of the Black vote, had both a political and a moral obligation to target remedies towards this subset of voters in the Black community. And of course, Obama's retort was, I'm the president of the entire United States, not just the black president, not just the president of Black America. And thus, to target policies towards any subset of people would be inappropriate for president. And he preferred these sort of broad sweep universalist policies. The Affordable Care Act is one such policy in which you would provide health care or try to facilitate health care for everyone.
Right.
But if you open the hood of the policy, you'll find that it had some particular emphasis on those who are in most need of health care. And so there's Medicaid expansion and so forth, which would, in a sort of quiet, sort of race neutral way, at least on the face of it, help people who were in the most dire straits in regard to accessing health care. So his idea was not to get caught up in any sort of debates in regard to race, again, to the consternation of many of his black critics. That was a dead-end street as far as he was concerned.
Yeah.
And if he had to take on race, take it on and then put it aside as quickly as possible. Policy-wise, he said that the more or less the store of white guilt in this country had evaporated. So any arguments in regard to historical discrimination or even ongoing discrimination generally wouldn't move the electorate. People vote for their own self-interest. White voters vote with their own self-interest at heart, as do other voters. So he didn't think he could sell policies that were targeted towards African Americans, regardless of arguments about historical discrimination or even their contemporary situation. But he did believe he could sell policies that had these sort of broad, sweeping impacts, whether it was education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's criminal justice reform, which were beneficial to everyone. Mm-hmm. Even if you looked at the fine print, those policies might be even more beneficial to those who are most vulnerable. So I was very much drawn to this ongoing percolating debate among African Americans, especially leadership, who thought that this guy really owed these voters, these black voters, almost to the exclusion of other voters who voted for him. And his pushback that, black voters alone did not put me in this office. And if I want to get reelected, then that's not the avenue to do it. That is to come off as a black president with a black agenda. That's the easiest way to be a one-term president.
And he was probably right about that. I mean, just the sheer numbers would indicate that. But when you talk to I'm particularly interested in when you had interviews with people, especially interviews without people outside the chattering classes, not the top media figures. But when you mention evangelical preachers and when you mention people closer to the everyday life of Americans, that fascinates me. What sort of complexity did you find in those opinions in Black America? I can imagine one is that, Obama is, first of all, he's too young. There are a lot of people who have been fighting this fight for a long time who should be ahead of him. Two, he's from Hawaii, so that's sort of a peripheral thing. And, he has this different background than most of us. So I can just imagine all kinds of different reactions to him as a person and him and his story. And I just wondered how that played out in the interviews that you did.
Oh, man, that's a great complicated question.
Well, sorry. So probably two or three questions in one, but there you go.
Those are the best kinds of questions. People are complex.
Yeah.
So I talked to folks who were in meetings with him, such as leaders of civil rights organizations, congressmen who knew him and so forth. But I did talk to a lot of folks, just ordinary folks that, colleagues, neighbors, relatives, and so forth. And the picture of him is, of course, a complicated, complex picture, but it's a truly interesting picture of him. So folks that I talked to, we might call ordinary folks, African Americans, if we want to look at that segment of people I talked to, a lot of pride in him and his election. There are a lot of folks, I can remember talking to my own dad, who was in his 70s when Obama was elected. And he didn't expect he'd see ever in his lifetime the election of a black president. He just, I think that was a common sentiment. And after Obama left office, Obama was the first person he'd ever voted for. He'd never voted before. And he was in his 70s and never voted. And after Obama left office, he, in 2016, had no expectation that he would go and vote again. I think he was strongly encouraged by others to stay politically engaged and actually vote. But just extraordinary pride in him. I talked to a preacher who had all sorts of issues with Obama when it came to support for abortion rights and especially same-sex marriage. But he said the same thing, that I was always proud of the man.
Yeah.
There was no big scandals attached to his time in office. He was competent. He was a serious guy in the office, and I voted for it. But I really did have big problems in regard to his stance on abortion rights and same-sex marriage for religious reasons, moral reasons. So you have people complicated like that. I think people tend to sort of pick and choose, almost like at a buffet, things that they like and don't like about politicians, and then they just make a call. That is, are there enough things that don't bother me about this person that I can support, as opposed to the things. So I found a lot of that. That is, in the first paragraph of our conversation, they would say how proud, they were to have a first family that was African-American and so forth. But the second paragraph in the next page of our conversations, it would be these things. Well, I didn't like this. I wish he had done more on gun rights or gun control. I wish he had done more in regard to climate change. I wish he, hadn't been so quick to embrace this policy. I wish he'd done a lot more on poverty. That was a through line.
Yeah.
More people were saying that. Not so much in regard to his background. Actually, I think that was probably a net plus, except for in regard to sort of the establishment class of the Black commentariat.
Right.
There are those who believe, whether it's the Jesse Jacksons or whether it was some others who believe, or at least they seem to, have embraced the idea that this guy needed to have come up through the ranks. There were people like Andrew Young, former mayor of Atlanta, who, said that this, I'd love to support this guy. In 2016, it was more or less Hillary Clinton's chance or time to run in 2008. So that notion that his Blackness or his Black experience was not sort of the authentic one, in which you have people who can trace their ancestry back into antebellum times, American slavery, and people who have relatives who can talk about their experiences during the civil rights movement and so forth. This guy can't do that.
Yeah.
And so I think that in some quarters was used as a cudgel against him, that say that he's not authentically Black. This guy is, what Black guy comes from Hawaii, Right. So I think that's something that he faces his whole life. That is his sort of the legitimacy of his Black experience. And it's something that I think he tries to combat by, community service in Chicago, getting steeped in that community. His wife is from there and so forth. So I think in his narrative of sort of self-making, he is very sensitive to this notion that there are those who are going to question his authenticity as a Black politician, just as a Black person. I didn't get a lot of that in the interviews that I had with sort of everyday people. It was mostly in folks inside of the bubble of Black politics and so forth who thought this guy needed to have a certain kind of pedigree to be really credible within American politics.
Was there any sense, or were there any comments that said that were sort of outside that? Someone might very well have said, "Oh, well, I'm glad he didn't come up in this establishment, if you will, and that we needed an outside voice and someone who's lived for a while in Indonesia as a kid and things like that." These are all very fresh things that might be good for the country.
I think that's what the vote eventually shows, right, in 2008.
Okay.
That people were ready for this guy, that the whole Hawaiian background, Kenyan father meets Kansas mother in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, works for him. The mixed race part, I think we have to take stock of the fact that this guy phenotypically in his appearance looks mixed. He doesn't look like he's straight from the African continent as his father was. So just phenotypically, or in his phenotype, his appearance was in that gray zone of race, really. Sort of he wasn't like his wife. Some people say his wife was a Black woman from afar. You just seeing her at any distance, you can this is an African-American woman. Not so much Obama. And I would argue that probably is a net bonus for him among all kinds of voters, even among Black voters. This is not your typical guy. This is not Barry Johnson or Barry Obama from Georgia, with long roots there. The whole Hawaii thing was exotic. It was new. But it also proved that not just any Black guy can become president. This is a guy with this very unique background, mixed race. He goes to Columbia undergrad. He goes to Harvard to get a JD degree. He's a state senator from Illinois, and then he's a U.S. senator from Illinois. So it's a certain sort of pedigree, there's a certain sort of elite Black experience, or mixed race experience, if you want to say, that makes him possible. So if this guy had been, Barry Obama from Georgia with long roots going back to slavery and gone to historically Black college or something like that, I don't know. I don't know if that story works or sells as well, as opposed to the sort of exotic, story, the mixed race story, the coming together of races, the Ivy League story. And then, of course, he goes through climbs the political ladder from state senator to U.S. senator. That's a particular kind of pedigree that is very rare, even unique in American politics, and works for him, which I think suggests that only a particular kind of unique Black experience opens that particular door to the presidency.
May I just go back a little bit to this buffet idea that you talked about earlier? Because one of the things I think that shows, and I think this happens a lot from a lot of different groups of voters, is that when you actually sit down and analyze it, and when, as you did, talk to people, a lot of American voters are very sophisticated and very strategic in their thinking. They say, well, yes, I like X, Y, and Z. I don't like A, B, and C, but it's better than the other version, in this case, in 2008, the John McCain version, and then in 2012, the Mitt Romney version. So I am going to strategically vote in this way. Did you find any patterns? I mean, did all evangelical or an awful lot of evangelical preachers say exactly the same thing? Well, we're definitely on the anti-abortion campaign, but in other ways he's acceptable, or is there even sophistication within that and divergence within those groups?
Oh yes, I think there's I know that there's divergence within the groups.
Okay.
There are those. I talked to several preachers of African American churches and congregations, and there were those who, I'm going to vote for this guy because I like his politics. We're not electing the preacher of the United States; we're electing the president of the United States.
Yeah, that's a good layout.
Even though I have issues with him on abortion rights, I have issues with this guy on same-sex marriage, and perhaps a host of other issues. He's saying what I need to hear about healthcare. He's saying what I need to hear about support for public education. He's saying what I need to hear about voting rights and so forth. And I think the Black congregations are just as sophisticated as you're saying, Joe. That is, people look at their options. They have two for the most part, Republicans or Democrats. You can go out and vote for the Libertarians and the Green Party people if you want to, but chances are you're going to enable more or less the Republican or the Democrat to get elected. So for the most part, we have two options here. And that people pick and choose. They look at the two options and they choose certain flavors from the options, and whichever one often is the least objectionable, that's the person they're going to vote for. So that's what I found to be the case among the people that I interviewed and did research on. That is, they understood that, in a two-party system, you're often voting for the least objectionable candidate, and that neither party may not have the perfect take on whatever the issue is, but, that's built into the cake. You're picking the party that is most like you on the critical mass of issues that you are most concerned about. So that's what I found. I did find some people, going back to the clergy, I did find some ministers who said that, hey, his stance on same-sex marriage is a bridge too far. And they went on, they mobilized to try to deny him a 2012 reelection. That, of course, was unsuccessful. And I think that was primarily a minority subset of Black clergy that did that. But you have a vocal minority really across the board. You find these folks in academia, you find these folks in the civil rights community and in Congress and so forth, who are, even though the idea of a Black president perhaps has some appeal to them, they do think that Obama either goes too far in regard to embrace of same-sex marriage or abortion rights, or doesn't go far enough in regard to help for the poor urban communities and so forth, and they turn on it. But again, that's a very vocal minority of folks as far as I can tell. I think the sort of lay persons, the broad majority of African Americans, if you look at the voting figures especially, and the polling figures, he doesn't poll beneath 80% approval rating among African Americans according to Gallup, but in 2 weeks, the hundreds of weeks of his presidency. Yeah. So what's going on among the masses and what's going on among the quote unquote leadership is often, there are often conversations that are at odds with each other, and the naysayers often, because they're the elites and they're in they have the microphones,
Mhm.
give you a sense that the outrage about Obama is a bit more greater than it is among the masses of people. But yeah, you do find those clergymen and others who think that whatever policy or whatever pronouncement he makes about whatever the issue is a bridge too far. Although, if you looked at the masses of people and the polling data and so forth, there's a disjuncture between what these leaders are saying and what the average Joe or Jane on the street is saying.
But that means you're also describing most voters in general. Most voters have some sort of sophisticated level of choosing the lesser of two evils or whatever it is. And what annoys, I think, historians, especially, this must drive political scientists nuts, is when you see phrases like the black vote used in the media, or when I study the 1960 Kennedy campaign, the Catholic vote. Now, I think the Catholic vote may have been more cohesive back then than it is now. But, it seems to me white or evangelicals might be making the same sorts of weighing things differently, the same way black evangelicals are, or Jewish voters are weighing things the same in different ways. I think it just seems to me that only the real extreme ideologues are knee-jerk voting. Everyone else seems to at least have a kind of rational process they go to.
I think so. I think that's exactly right. Certainly with black voters, they're in national elections, presidential elections, they swing decisively in favor of the Democratic candidate.
Yeah.
But that's only one metric. We shouldn't just look at the percentages that the Democratic candidate gets, but also the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
That is, in 2016, the folks who showed up for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012 didn't show up for Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Yeah.
Although she won 89, 90% of the black vote, there were fewer of those black voters who came out to the polls, and thus costing her the election. And you could argue that staying at home is a way of sort of voting, choosing not to participate in the process is a kind of agency. It's a kind of messaging about the process. So, of course, in hindsight, a lot of people would say that Hillary Clinton had a lot of other issues going on and not just black voters.
Sure.
In that particular case, the percentage of the vote that the Democratic candidate gets mask the actual numbers of folks who are coming out in key states to actually support them. In the case of Hillary Clinton, she not being able to put together the kind of coalition that Obama was able to put together, even though her percentages of black voters are fairly close to what his percentages are. But the actual numbers of people don't put her over the top in enough places.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the metrics that's over-reported by the John Kings of CNN and the Steve Kornackis of MSNBC. The high percentage, as you say, masks that vote. Well, maybe we move on to the second half of this theme, which is complex, layered, and fractured views about the meaning of the Obama presidency. You talk a lot about in the book about the experiences during the Obama presidency, but now that it's been over and now that the book is out and you're talking to people in the community, in the academic community and the media community about the book, what sort of complex, layered, sorry, Buzzkills, I just love this theme, the way the professor set it up. Complex, layered, fractured views appear about the meaning of it now that everybody technically is looking back, even though it was only a few years ago.
Context matters.
Yeah.
Historians, we're all about the context. So we can only think about the Obama presidency now through the prism of the Trump presidency and somewhat through the prism of the Biden presidency.
Right.
As well.
Yeah.
So we have to put him in the context of, George W. Bush right before him, and now Trump and Biden. So he looks a little different. His presidency looks a little different as opposed to the years in which he was actually president. And our hindsight of his presidency is filtered through Trump and Biden currently. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me as a historian is the kinds of things that Obama could not do as president, as opposed to what Trump and even Biden can do as president. And I think that's largely filtered through the context of the times, but also race as well. For example, I can remember when Joe Biden was campaigning in 2020 to become the candidate of the Democratic Party for the presidency. Publicly, he said, "I've always had the support of the Black community and I will have the back of the Black community."
Yeah.
And that's just something that Barack Obama just couldn't say. He just is not going to say that.
Right.
And even if he, thought it, and I'm not even sure if he ever thought that, certainly he wasn't going to say that during the times in which he was president, in the midst of this economic catastrophe, and in the midst of this Tea Party insurrection in the Republican Party, and then the birtherism that's trying to paint him as not even being a citizen and legitimate in the office. He's not going to say, the black, I have the back of the black community. He's not quite in the way that Biden said it. So Biden, I think, is allowed to say that, or he can get away with saying that, one, by not being of the black community. Two, I think having served as the VP of the first black president, he could sort of, and then this all filtered through Trump. He was at a point in which he could say that, but Obama couldn't. His embrace in that sort of public way of being sort of a stalwart supporter of the black community is something that he couldn't embrace. Trump, of course, is the self-conscious, self-positioned anti-Obama.
Yeah.
So if Obama did it, it must be wrong, and we're going to try to reverse it, whether it was the Affordable Care Act, whether it's the Paris Climate Accords, whether it's the pact with Iran not to build nuclear weapons, so whatever it was, if Obama was for it, then I must be against it. So that's also one lens we have to try to think of the Obama presidency through. That is the durability of his legacy when his successor comes into office and tries to reverse nearly all of it.
Right.
And he's successful in some instances because some of that legacy of Obama is built on executive orders, which are not durable. So, for example, DACA, or this program that allowed for young people born here to stay here legally, as long as they had no criminal records and so forth. The Trump administration reverses that and tries to reverse nearly everything else on immigration policy. So it shows us the sort of tenuous nature of presidential legacies and even executive power when the next person comes in and starts reversing. And Biden has done the same with Trump. Mm-hmm. His policies or his sort of positions on immigration, and Trump's less than avid support for environmental protections and so forth. Biden has tried to reverse those sorts of things. So the book is, again, attempting to situate Obama and his presidency within this longer view so that we get him juxtaposed against other presidencies, but especially those presidencies in which he's sort of sandwiched in between the Bush presidency, but particularly the Trump presidency as well. And again, one of the takeaways is just the nature of the presidency and the nature of the tenuousness of presidential legacy. And Obama's, especially in terms of the things he was able to get done and the things that he wasn't able to get done, and the things that his successor was able to reverse or else challenge.
Yes, it was amazing. One of the things we're learning all kinds of things about the presidency, including the fragility of presidential legacy, and that it continually shocked me in the Trump administration how quickly he could overturn things. Well, I want to end this interview with one sort of special question. I know how the book is doing out in the academic world and in the chattering classes on the talk show circuit, but what has the president said to you about this? Has President Obama called you at 3 a.m. and say, no, on page 67, you got this wrong, and or anyone from his team? Have you heard from the Georgetown Obama group about their reactions to the book?
I haven't yet, Joe. Actually, a New York Times review of the book, a very positive review, appeared about a week ago, and I was hoping that would be the linchpin. That is, Obama's a reader. He reads the Times, or somebody he knows reads the Times and say, hey, this guy's written a book about you. Take a look. So fingers crossed. I was not able to land a review or an interview with him during the writing of the book, and I understand, this guy doesn't know me, and he's catching his breath right after leaving the office, and he's writing his own book, so he doesn't want to, give away his own thunder. But I'm hopeful that President Obama will maybe see this podcast or hear this podcast, or see something in the New York Times and say, let me talk to this guy, even if it's to go on the record and say, okay, Professor Clegg, this is okay, but you really should have tried harder to talk to me before you printed this, or whatever. I think that I'd like to say that he would be pleased with the book because it tries to have a very balanced approach to him, nonpartisan approach to his time in office. But not yet. Joe, I haven't got that call yet. If you know some people that know some people who know some people close to President Obama, certainly by all means, send them a copy of this podcast. But I haven't had the pleasure of talking to President Obama at this point.
I wish I could say that I knew that the president and Michelle Obama were huge fans of the show, but I don't know that. I
Probably
could
hard.
claim a tall tale. I could make a tall tale of it. But I think as soon as he reads it, and as soon as his administration officials read it, former administration officials read it, they'll really like it, and they'll like the fact, very much like the fact, and I don't mean this in a partisan way. I think any sophisticated thinker will like the fact that this really is the first. This is going to set the paradigm for the way we discuss the Obama presidency from here on out.
That's the hope.
Yeah.
That's an excellent aspiration. So.
Well, we want to tell the Buzzkillers that not only is the book on the Buzzkill bookshelf in the blog post for this episode, but we have a copy courtesy of Johns Hopkins University Press, who's published the book, and more importantly, for our Patreon listeners, we have what's known as an advanced press copy. So if you're one of our Patreon supporters, you can enter the drawing to win the book, and you get to be part of the club of the people who are in the sort of advanced group that gets books before they come out. So anyway, do that, Buzzkillers, but also let's thank Professor Clegg for coming on the show.
Joe, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much for your interest.
Okay, and we'll talk to all the rest of you out there next week. go down to 35 minutes or something like that. We don't really edit for content. Thankfully, I think you said and about 4 times in the entire interview, which never happens. It's never that good. Usually I have to spend 3 hours cutting out those. So, and the other thing we want to do is we want to make this one of our featured shows in January. We're doing a lot of things, including having a major website relaunch in January. So the show is going to have what I hope is a renaissance, and and this is going to be a linchpin to that. So that's why I want to schedule it for January. I think if we put it out this month, it'll kind of get buried in holiday stuff, and so yeah, we'll do. Yeah. Okay, and please tell your colleagues at UNC and in the profession that, you know, this is a good show to come on, because I'm a former historian, academic historian. I flatter myself that I ask the best questions. Um, uh, well, I'm glad to hear that. Glad to hear that. Thank you for saying that. That I think is our calling card, frankly. So I can't remember who else from the UNC I've interviewed, but there must have been people, certainly. Well, anyway. So thanks again, and I'll keep you posted. All right, thanks.